My name is Rocky Lhotka. I'm one of the co-chairs for VS Live. I'm the chair of Cloud and Containers Live, and I love Blazor. And so I'm basically going to spend the next 20 minutes talking to you about how you can use Blazor to create truly native apps for iOS, Android, Windows, and Mac. And now there's a kind of rekindled open source project to get this whole thing to support Linux desktops as well. So hopefully that does go somewhere. But right now, we've got the 4 targets. So the way this works is Blazor can be hosted and normally is hosted in a browser, right? And so either your Blazor code is running on a server with a Signal R pipe bidirectional connection that connects it to the browser, so the user gets what feels like an immediate interactive experience, even though your code is running on the server. Or your code can run in WebAssembly, actually in the browser on the client device, which is pretty cool. And starting with Blazor 8, there's actually a thing called interactive auto, which is a render mode that will graduate smoothly from the server model to the WebAssembly model. So that's all pretty cool. But none of that really gets you to the point where you've got full access to your mobile phone or your operating system or whatever. It's still, everything in that world is running in the browser sandbox. And now the browser sandbox has gotten pretty powerful, so for most of us, that's probably enough. But if you want to be able to reformat somebody's hard drive, whatever it is that you want to do, more practically, maybe you're writing a manufacturing system, you need to be able to talk to some actual device through some USB or serial port, or I don't know what people might be using anymore these days. I used to live in that world. And so you need access to things on the device, either on a PC or on a phone, that are not accessible through the browser sandbox. The other thing is that with Blazor WebAssembly, you can create something called a PWA, or Progressive Web App. And so that is actually a client-side app that's running in the browser and can even run offline. And so all of a sudden, you should evaluate that too, because if you can live within the context or confines of the browser sandbox, and you are not intentionally looking to use store deployment like through Apple's store or Google Play, PWA might be a good option. The big thing with a PWA is because it's running in the browser sandbox, local storage is limited, especially on Apple devices. Apple grudgingly supports these technologies, but you can imagine that if you had full access to storage on a device, then why would you need the Apple Store? And Apple makes a lot of money on the Apple Store. So they intentionally restrict a lot of things in order to discourage us from deploying our apps through the browser. So here we are. We need to go through the mobile environment. But kind of pro and con, and really the first decision point you have to understand is that if I'm creating a native app, I will be deploying that app in some mechanism, usually through the store. If it's an enterprise or corporate app, you might use something like Intune to do the deployment. But nonetheless, you have to have a deployment strategy because we're not using just the user goes to a URL. We are truly deploying a native app to the device. Because we are a native app, we have full access to all the storage on the device. You have access to all the APIs on the device and so forth. So you can do whatever you need. So then one of the things you have to consider is, why are you doing this, right? In other words, if I'm doing it for a manufacturing thing, I might only need to target Windows, because maybe my device that's talking to my manufacturing machine is a Windows device. If I'm building something for retail, that's on a phone that's talking to some sort of card reader or something like that, now I'm gonna have to target the phone. Maybe I don't care to target Windows or the Mac. And the reason I go through this is because there's a whole lot of user experience differences between fitting your content on this screen versus fitting your content on that screen. right? And although we can do all these things, there's time and money involved. And that's all I have for slides. So let's just kind of get into the code here. So here we are. This is the new Visual Studio, but the 2022 has a similar experience. I can say I would like to create a new project. And if I go up here and type MAUI, because really what we're dealing with is using MAUI, which is the replacement or successor to Xamarin. This is the technology that allows you to use .NET to create mobile apps. And what we're doing here is using MAUI as a host for Blazor. So we avoid using XAML. We avoid using most of the different low-level MAUI type stuff. And we're able to build our actual application and user experience using Blazor. Again, you may or may not see this as an advantage, right? Because you're like, no, I love XAML. In which case you can just use MAUI. But I think most of us prefer to use HTML and CSS. We have a lot more experience and whatnot. And so using Blazor is often a better experience from a developer perspective. But this does bring me to probably my final differentiation point here. And that is, if I use Blazor to create a mobile app or a native app, all of them are going to look the same, right, across all the platforms. There will be differences, like some of the calendar controls and time pickers and the buttons. There will be some styling differences between Mac and Windows and iOS and Android. That just kind of comes with the territory. But your actual experience is going to be the same as an end user. And so if I'm creating something that's representing my brand, this might not be the right answer for you. Does that make sense? In other words, if I'm an airline and I have an app like I'm Delta or United or somebody, I would hope that their Android app feels like an Android app and their iOS app feels like an iOS app, because this truly represents their brand. Now, in reality, most of these big companies no longer even bother with that because it's too expensive. You'll notice the Delta app is pretty much the same across every platform, right? It didn't used to be, but it pretty much is now, because it's just too darn expensive to maintain the whole thing multiple times. Anyway, but does that make sense, right? That's a differentiation point. So now if we zoom in here just a little bit on this screen, maybe not quite that zoomy. I can create a .NET MAUI app. That's just MAUI by itself. I can create a MAUI Blazor Hybrid app. And this is the template that's been around now for several years. And so this is how we have done it before, and you can continue to do it. There is a class library, but then there's this relatively new one. This was introduced in .NET 9 and now .NET 10, and it's the MAUI Blazor Hybrid and web app. And you might say, well, what's the value of that? Because I want to create I'm trying to create a mobile app. What do I care about the web? Well, here's a important consideration, and that is debugging code in the mobile environment is not fun. It's a pain in the butt. There's just a lot of moving pieces because you're dealing with iOS, you're dealing with Android, you're dealing with maybe the Java runtime on Android, then on top of which .NET is running. There's just a lot of moving pieces, and it's a pain. And having built real apps like this, what I have learned is that you're best off if you can also have a web interface, especially if it's a WebAssembly PWA type thing, because that allows you to do, and your users, to do a lot of basic testing of the app's functionality in the browser, and allows you as a developer to do debugging in the browser where it's much better, a much simpler environment. And it doesn't mean you still end up testing and working through all the mobile platforms, but before you deal with the idiosyncrasies of Android versus Mac, you can at least know that your overall application code works. You know what I mean? You're talking to the database, or all the basic stuff you can get working, and then you can spend time messing around on a per platform basis. So I highly recommend that, just as a tip. So I'm going to pick that one. I'm going to say, okay, I want to create one of those. So then I get to pick the name of the thing. I don't really want it to go there. That's not the folder, not the one. All right, let's make it go there. And we'll just click next. And notice that the wizard now comes up with some options and says, okay, what version of .NET do you want to target? Do you want to configure, because we not only are doing a mobile version, but we're doing a web version. So the web version can and should be HTTPS. The web version can have server, WebAssembly, or auto. My recommendation again is pick WebAssembly for your render mode, because then that is the closest to being a mobile app, but still running in the browser. And then you can pick the other options or not as you choose. And then we'll click create. And while it's creating, I'm going to go to a pre-created version. Where are you? There you are. So here, if we look at the resulting solution, because again, 20 minutes, right? What we end up with are 3 projects in the solution. We end up with the Blazor project itself, and this one is MAUI. And you can tell it's MAUI because it has a platforms folder. And in the platforms folder, there's a folder for Android, iOS, Mac, and Windows. And the key thing here to understand is that in the MAUI environment, anything that's in the project, in this project that you see on screen, will compile across all platforms. So if any code you put here will apply to all 4 platforms. But any code that you put in a platforms folder is special. It's treated special by the build process. And so any code that I put into the Android subfolder will only compile on Android. It does not compile for Mac or Windows or iOS. And the same is true for all these other folders. And so this allows me, for example, to put Android-specific or Mac-specific code in my app if I need to, because the whole reason for doing this, presumably, is that we're trying to get at something that you can't do in the browser sandbox. All right? And so I'm going to probably end up writing some per platform code in order to enable that. The rest of this is largely, and there is a XAML. I said you don't have to deal with XAML, but if we open this XAML and just look at it, what it turns out is that this XAML is hosting something that hosts Blazor. In fact, I guess if I go just this whole block, it's something called a Blazor web view. So we actually don't normally ever touch this XAML. The XAML is here because this is the MAUI page that hosts Blazor, and that everything else you do is in Blazor. Now, all of the Blazor code is in this shared project, which I'll come to back in a minute. First, though, let's look at the Blazor HOL web. So this is the web server. This is an ASP.NET Core web server that's hosting your Blazor, or at least allowing you to download the WebAssembly part, whatever it might be. And so this is just, got your normal program CS to control ASP.NET and that sort of thing. All the real work happens in my thing here in this shared directory or folder, project, DLL, wherein I have all my Razor pages, my home page, my counter page, my person edit page, whatever it might be, is all here. And so what this allows me to do is I can say, and I'm not going to launch this in Android. I actually have the emulator already running because it takes several valuable minutes to do this. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Oh, man. I'm going to move on to my next demo because who knows why this is happening. I'm not going to mess around with it. So, but I can also, if we look here, because I'm running this in the mobile space, I can say, well, I would like to run it on my Pixel emulator. I would like to run it on Windows. I would like to run it on an iOS remote device, a simulator. If I used a cable and plugged my phone in, I could run it on my actual physical phone. Right? These are all options. The other thing that I can do is I can go over here into the Solution Explorer and I can right-click on the web project, and I can set this as my startup project. And now when I launch this, it's going to launch the app in the browser. And this doesn't take as long normally. And so we can see already that it's coming up. It's basically the standard Blazor app with the counter and whatever else. But what's important here is it says it's running on web on Windows NT. And so that information is actually a way of showing us how this cross-platform stuff works. And so if we look in the project, this is the Blazor project, I have a services folder. And in here, there's an interface called iFormFactor. So this says, okay, in any page in my project can use an iFormFactor to get at, am I running on a mobile device? Am I running on the browser? Whatever I'm running on. Well, how is that implemented? Well, the iFormFactor you can see is implemented in a number of different places. And probably the easiest thing to do is just to go look, for example, on the browser. The iFormFactor is implemented saying we're running on the web and we're going to get the operating system that we're running on. And if we look at the mobile app, it is implemented to say that we are running on some sort of mobile device. Well, it turns out that in MAUI, you've got this device info object that will say, oh, I'm running on Android, or I'm running on Mac, or I'm running on Windows. And then it will also be able to return device information about the operating system, like the version of Android and so forth. That's what I would have shown you had my emulator not messed up. So that hopefully gives you this idea of how I can create an interface and then implement it per platform, right? So I can get per platform code. The last thing I want to show in the just a couple minutes I have left is much more of a real app. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Oh man, what is going on? I'm gonna kill this and I'm gonna hopefully restart it. Come on. While this is hopefully restarting quickly, let me run it in the browser. So this is a real project that is being worked on for a nonprofit. Okay, let's restart the emulator. Let's hope it works. So this is a Kids ID Kit app. So, actually this is my wife's nonprofit. Well, she didn't start it. It's been, Missing Children Minnesota is the longest running missing child organization in the US. It's been around for decades. And my wife now runs this organization. And like a lot of advocacy all over the country, you go to your county fairs or your state fairs and you'll find groups that are like, hey, here's a pamphlet that you can fill out with all the information about your child so that if your child were to ever go missing, you would have all this information. Well, the problem with doing it on paper is if you fill it out at all, which most people never do, but if you fill it out, you're going to put it in a drawer somewhere, and then when your child goes missing, you will have forgotten about it, and it's also 2 years old, and your child was this tall and is now this tall, and right. So the idea here is suppose that we could put all your child information into your phone, and have the phone every 6 months pop up and say, hey, I bet your child has grown. You might want to, update their hair color and their eye, height and whatever else might have changed, because as we all know, children grow like weeds. And, but that way, and also, were your child to go missing, you would have the information you need in your pocket so that you can answer all the questions that the police and everybody else are going to be asking you, right? So this is the app. And so the reason, again, that we're testing this that we have the web version of this is for debugging purposes, the web is much easier. Also, though, even for end user testing, how do you test an iOS app? How do your end users do it? Well, you have to go to Apple. You have to get an Apple developer license. You have to go through this whole thing in order to get the app into the store such that it's in a beta mode. And then you can only have so many beta testers. And this is true for Google too. It's basically a pain in the butt with a lot of paperwork and infrastructure work just to get this in the hands of people. Whereas this is actually a PWA with a public URL. So people can literally just go to the Azure host site where we're running this thing and use it. And we can keep iterating and developing and changing this thing and get user feedback. And again, I'm not saying we don't have to test it on mobile, because we do, but we can get a lot of our testing and things like the look and feel, navigation, all that sort of stuff we're able and have been able to improve radically just through this mechanism, while we concurrently are making sure that it's also running on phones. Right? I believe then that I am out of time. So with that, I want to thank you all very, very much. Hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope you learned something fun here. Thanks.